This is a fictional story inspired by real life. Arthur drove his battered old pickup truck along the winding, fog-drenched roads of the Blue Ridge Mountains as the October sun of 1998 dipped below the horizon, painting the peaks of North Carolina in shades of deep, melancholic orange. The engine of the vehicle emitted a tired, metallic moan that seemed to echo Arthur's own profound exhaustion. He had left behind the frantic pace of the big city, the noisy streets of Charlotte, and, most painfully, the house he had shared with Catherine for more than 30 years. Since she had passed away, the silence of those walls had become absolutely deafening, with every object acting as a trigger for a longing that he could no longer bear to carry. Arthur had sold most of his assets and purchased a secluded stone cottage, a place that time seemed to have forgotten among the rolling hills, where the only company would be the wind and the distant sound of the rushing creek. He was not looking for a new beginning, but rather a quiet place to wait for the end, a sanctuary where his memories could finally rest alongside him. Upon parking in front of the property, he noticed that the heavy oak front door was slightly ajar, moving gently with the cold breeze that cascaded down from the high ridges. A deep furrow marked his weathered face as he stepped out of the truck, for he was absolutely certain that he had left it locked during his last visit a few days prior. With his heart beating in an uncharacteristic rhythm of caution, he grabbed the kerosene lantern from the passenger seat, lit the flickering flame, and walked toward the entrance. The rhythmic creaking of the floorboards beneath his heavy boots sounded like a desperate cry in that absolute void. The air inside the cottage was thick with the scent of damp earth, ancient wood, and the bitter trail of ashes from a fireplace that had not seen a fire in a very long time. As the light from the lantern sliced through the dense shadows of the living room, Arthur heard a sharp, dry thud, followed by a rapid, panting breath, much like that of a cornered animal. He raised the light higher, revealing a corner of the room where a young woman was huddled, tightly clutching two small children near the cold, blackened hearth. The woman stood up with a sudden jolt, her eyes wide with absolute terror, her face marked by extreme fatigue and the biting cold that punished the mountain region during that time of year. "Please do not put us out," she whispered, with a choked voice, a plea that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. Arthur remained perfectly still, in the light of the lantern, illuminating a scene of desolation that he never expected to find in his final dwelling place. The young woman had dark hair tied back in a messy knot, and wore clothes that were visibly worn out and completely insufficient for the rigorous mountain climate. Behind her, a boy and a girl, who could not have been more than 5 years of age, watched him from under an old frayed blanket, with eyes that mixed deep curiosity and instinctive fear. "Who are you, and what are you doing in my house?" he asked, trying to keep his voice firm, even though something in the fragility of that scene had begun to pierce the heavy armor he had built around himself. The woman swallowed hard, trying to regain some dignity despite her precarious situation. "My name is Lucy, and these are Miles and Alice. We arrived yesterday in the middle of the thickest fog. We just needed a roof to protect us from the storm." Lucy lowered her head, promising they would leave the following morning. But Arthur noticed that the little ones were shivering with cold in a way that no promise could ever warm. Without saying another word, he turned his back and walked out into the dark night, returning to his truck under the cutting wind. Minutes later, he re-entered the house carrying fresh sourdough bread, a block of sharp cheddar cheese, a thermos of warm milk, and a thick wool blanket that had once belonged to Catherine. Little Miles's eyes brightened at the sight of the food, asking with pure innocence if all of that was truly for them. Arthur placed the supplies on the rustic wooden table and ordered with a softness he didn't know he possessed that they should eat first. Lucy fought back tears as she broke the bread into small pieces for her children, while little Alice remained huddled against her mother's skirt, half asleep from sheer exhaustion. The boy, however, continued to observe Arthur with a serenity that felt unsettling. "Do you live here all by yourself?" the boy questioned between bites of bread. Arthur took a long time to find the words, feeling the immense weight of that simple question. Yes, he finally replied, and I intend to keep it that way. The boy tilted his head as if that answer was the saddest thing he had ever heard, and the silence of the house, which had been Arthur's primary goal, suddenly felt filled with something new and deeply disturbing. The next morning in the Appalachian Highlands dawned, wrapped in a thick, milky mist that rose from the valleys, transforming the landscape into a scene of dreams and uncertainty. Arthur woke up early, as had been his custom for decades, but the awakening felt entirely different this time. The silence he had cultivated so carefully had been replaced by the sound of crackling wood and the aroma of coffee that began to pierce the cold mountain air. When he walked into the kitchen, he found Lucy bent over the old cast-iron stove, trying to keep a flame alive while heating some water. Miles was running in small circles around little Alice, whose childish laughter echoed off the stone walls, giving the house a vibration it probably hadn't felt in 50 years. As soon as she noticed the owner of the house, Lucy became visibly tense, quickly adjusting the blanket over her shoulders and assuming a defensive posture. "Good morning, mister." "Arthur? We are already organizing our things to leave," she said, her voice heavy with a caution that revealed the invisible scars of someone who had been evicted from many places before. Arthur merely nodded his head, picking up a bucket to fetch water from the well, but he paused for a moment to observe the transformation of the room. The windows, once covered in thick cobwebs, had been cleaned roughly, and the floor had been swept, with dry leaves piled neatly in a corner. Lucy seemed to be the type of person who, even without possessing anything, felt the need to leave order wherever she passed, perhaps as a way of paying for the hospitality she hadn't been invited to receive. Later, as Arthur headed to the outskirts of the property to inspect the apple trees and the few fruit bushes that remained, he felt small footsteps following close behind him. Miles was right there, with his chest puffed out and a determined look in his eyes. "I can help you, sir. I know how to carry buckets and pull weeds," the boy announced with the seriousness of someone who already understands that life requires effort. Arthur thought about refusing, about saying that he preferred the solitude of his work, but something in the boy's persistence made him simply point to the stones that needed to be removed from the dirt path. For hours, the two worked side by side under the mild sun that finally defeated the morning mist. The boy talked incessantly, asking about the names of the birds, the age of the old oaks, and why Arthur had decided to live in such a hidden place. "Sometimes people need to be alone to think," the man explained, trying to summarize decades of pain into a single, simple sentence. Miles stopped carrying a stone and looked at him with profound depth. "My mom says that staying alone too long makes the heart grow mold," the little one retorted with a wisdom that only necessity can teach. That sentence hit Arthur like an unexpected blow, making him question if what he called peace was really just the beginning of that mold on his soul. He looked at his calloused hands, and then at the small, dirty hands of the boy, feeling a strange connection he wasn't ready to acknowledge. When they returned to the main house, they found a simple table set with great care. Lucy had prepared a lunch with the few ingredients Arthur had brought: slices of bread toasted on the stovetop, chopped tomatoes, and a drizzle of olive oil. In the center of the table, a small glass held a few yellow wildflowers that Alice had picked in the backyard. The house was still cold and full of drafts, but the human presence was beginning to warm the darkest corners. Arthur sat at the head of the table, feeling like a stranger in his own home. Yet the sound of the children's spoons hitting the plates created a melody that was strangely comforting. The following days passed in an organic and silent routine. Arthur repaired the broken roof tiles and the fallen fences, while Lucy took over the domestic tasks with a quiet efficiency, mending his old clothes and keeping the kitchen constantly clean. Alice, who was more timid, began to leave small offerings near Arthur's tools: a pretty stone, a dry leaf of a curious shape, or a bright flower that had fallen to the ground. Miles, for his part, became Arthur's shadow, learning how to handle the tools and listening to the few stories the old man allowed himself to tell about life on the farm. The isolation was still there, but it was being shared, and that made all the difference in the world. The coexistence in the stone house began to mold a new reality, transforming the cold structure into a pulsing home. The mornings now had a defined rhythm. The sound of the battery-powered radio tuned to distant news, the hiss of the kettle, and the constant murmur of the children. Arthur noticed that his productivity had increased significantly. He no longer worked out of mere obligation, but to ensure that the roof did not leak over the heads of the little ones, and that the stove always had dry wood. Lucy, though she still maintained a certain reserve, began to hum softly while washing clothes in the creek that ran through the back of the property, melodies that spoke of hope and better times. Alice, who used to hide at the slightest sign of Arthur's presence, now ran to the porch as soon as she heard the characteristic sound of his heavy footsteps returning from the orchard. The girl, with her 5 years of age, possessed a rare sensitivity. She noticed the old man's mood swings and, without saying a word, would sit next to him on the porch steps, offering her silent presence as a balm. Miles, on the other hand, was increasingly interested in the secrets of the earth. He wanted to know how the seeds knew when to sprout and why the apple trees needed so much care. "When I grow up, I want to have a farm just like this one," the boy would say, with shining eyes while helping to carry the wicker baskets. Arthur, who previously rarely smiled, found himself laughing at the boy's wild theories about how birds talk to each other. On a sunny Sunday, he decided it was time to go to the town center to replenish the stock of supplies. He needed flour, oil, salt, and some new tools for the barn repair. Lucy hesitated when he invited her to go along with the children. "Perhaps it is better if we stay here, Mr. Arthur. We do not want to draw attention," she whispered with a shadow of concern crossing her face. Arthur, however, insisted that the children needed to see the movement and have an ice cream in the main square. He felt a strange urge to show them the world, or perhaps to show the world that he was no longer alone. During the 10-kilometer journey to the urban part of Willow Creek, Miles did not stop pointing at the cattle in the pastures and the trucks that crossed the highway. Alice observed the colorful houses and the flowering gardens with a silent wonder, as if she were discovering a completely new world. When they arrived at the central square near the historic church, the atmosphere changed instantly. As soon as Arthur stepped out of the truck with Lucy and the children, the conversations at the outdoor cafe tables ceased. Whispers began to spread like smoke in the wind, and the curious eyes of the townspeople followed their every move. Mrs. Higgins, the owner of a traditional bakery on the corner, came out to the sidewalk with a dish towel in her hands, observing the scene with a curiosity that was anything but discreet. "Look at that!" Arthur Vance finally decided to show up, she whispered to a neighbor, her eyes fixed on young Lucy and the little ones who held the old widower's hands. Arthur felt the weight of the judgments, but he kept his posture erect, leading his improvised family into the general store. Inside, two men he had known for a long time stopped talking abruptly. One of them, in a tone that was meant to be low but was perfectly audible, remarked that he hadn't taken long to replace the late Catherine with someone much younger. Arthur felt his blood boil and his jaw tighten, but Miles's small hand squeezed his, bringing him back to reality. The boy, unaware of the adult's malice, asked if they could have those colorful candies in the glass display case later. Arthur simply nodded, ignoring the accusing glares, but he noticed that Lucy was visibly shaken. She walked with her head down, trying to become invisible, which was impossible in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business. The air in the store felt heavy, and the simple act of buying flour felt like an act of defiance against a community that preferred its tragedies to stay quiet and predictable. The way back home was marked by an uncomfortable silence. The children's enthusiasm had been dampened by the tension between the adults. Upon arriving home, Lucy went straight to the kitchen. Her movements were now jerky and nervous. "We should not have gone to town," she said finally while cutting potatoes for dinner, her hands trembling slightly. Arthur tried to calm her down, saying that people would always have something to say regardless of what he did. "Yes, but now they are talking about you because of me, and that is not fair," she countered with watery eyes. She felt like a burden, a stain on the reputation of the man who had been her only savior. Later, when night had already fallen and the children were almost asleep in front of the fireplace, there was a soft knock on the door. It was Father Thomas, the local priest, who had known Arthur since his youth. The clergyman entered slowly, taking off his hat and observing the environment with a look that mixed compassion and concern. "Good evening, Arthur. I came to see how you are adapting to the new house," the priest began, sitting at the table. He sighed deeply before continuing, explaining that the comments in the parish were becoming quite heavy. "Catherine's memory is still very much alive for the people here, and seeing you with a young woman and children awakens malicious tongues that do not understand charity." Arthur clenched his fists on the table, feeling the burning injustice of the words. "I simply gave a roof to those who had nothing, Father. That is not a sin." The priest agreed, but warned that rumors had the power to destroy anyone's peace before it even had a chance to settle. Those words hung in the room like a black cloud, suffocating the little joy they had managed to win. When the priest left, the silence that followed was the heaviest Arthur had ever experienced. He looked at Lucy and saw that she was already packing her few clothes into the cardboard suitcase. "What are you doing?" he asked, with a sudden fear gripping his chest. "Tomorrow we will leave," she replied, without looking him in the eyes. "I will not allow them to destroy your reputation and your peace. You have a right to your life, and we are just passing through." Arthur wanted to protest. He wanted to say that he didn't care what the world thought, but the words got stuck in his throat. For the first time since Catherine died, he felt a real terror, the fear of going back to being just a man waiting for death in an empty stone house. He realized that the peace he had sought was actually a prison, and Lucy and the children were the only ones who held the key to his release. The rain began to fall just before midnight, a typical mountain storm that beat hard against the wooden windows of the stone house. Arthur remained sitting in front of the fireplace, whose flames were already dying slowly, leaving only reddish embers that reflected in his tired eyes. A few meters away, Lucy's small suitcase was closed near the door, a cruel symbol of the imminent departure. He couldn't stop thinking about the question Miles had asked before going to bed. "Will you still have breakfast with us tomorrow, Grandpa Arthur?" Arthur realized that in recent years, no one had expected anything from him, and now the idea of waking up and not finding the vibrant energy of those children caused him physical pain. Lucy had hardly spoken to him that night. She moved like a resigned shadow, a wanderer who clearly loathed that destiny, but accepted it to protect the only man who had been kind to them. She sat in the dark, watching the rain, her heart breaking for the stability her children were about to lose once again. Every thunderclap seemed to emphasize the instability of their lives. Arthur watched her from across the room, seeing the silhouette of a woman who had fought far too many battles alone, and he felt a surge of protectiveness that surpassed any fear of town gossip or social standing. Near dawn, Miles woke up startled by a loud crack of thunder and walked into the living room, still half-dazed from sleep. In the dark, he ended up bumping into the table and knocking over the box of photographs that Arthur had left there. "Sorry, Grandpa Arthur," the boy whispered, using the term he had adopted in recent days while trying to gather the papers scattered on the floor. Under the weak light of the embers, the boy picked up a specific photo, the one of Catherine at the orphanage in Charlotte, surrounded by orphaned children she helped as a volunteer. "She was your wife, wasn't she?" Miles asked, handing the photo to Arthur. Arthur nodded his head, feeling a heavy weight in his heart. Yes, that was Catherine. Inside the box, besides the photos, there was a folded letter that Arthur had avoided reading for months. His hands shook as he unfolded the aged paper, recognizing the delicate and firm handwriting of his late wife. While the rain lashed the roof, He began to read the words that seemed to come from another world. "If one day I am no longer by your side, Arthur, promise me that you will not turn our home into a mausoleum of silence. Although life did not give us biological children, I always knew you would be a wonderful father, for your heart is bigger than your stubbornness." Arthur stopped reading, feeling his throat close up. He remembered how Catherine had wished for a house full of life, and how he, immersed in work and material concerns, always said they still had time. Time, however, had been a silent thief. Miles looked at him with curiosity. She wanted to have kids, didn't she? Arthur wiped a tear that insisted on falling. Yes, she wanted them very much. The boy smiled sadly. Then she would really like us being here, wouldn't she? Those words were the final blow to Arthur's defenses. The tears held back for so long under a mask of indifference began to flow freely over the crumpled letter. It was the first time he had truly cried since the funeral, a cry that washed the soul and removed the mold from the heart that Miles had mentioned days before. The boy approached and hugged him around the neck, a gesture of pure affection that no words could ever replace. From the kitchen door, Lucy observed the scene with watery eyes, finally understanding that this house wasn't just saving her children from hunger and cold, it was rescuing a man from the abyss of loneliness. However, the weight of social judgment still haunted her, and she felt she had to be the strong one and follow through with her decision to leave for the sake of his honor. "The bus to Charlotte leaves at 7 o'clock in the morning," she said with a trembling voice, trying to maintain the decision to depart. Arthur raised his head, his eyes determined in a way they hadn't been in years. "You are not going anywhere, Lucy." She shook her head, arguing that she didn't want to be the reason for his sadness or the attacks from the townspeople. "I've spent too long caring about what people think and not enough about what people feel," Arthur said, standing up. The silence returned to rain, broken only by the sound of the wind blowing through the apple trees before dawn. Lucy woke the children while the sky was still a bruised purple. Alice was still in a deep sleep when she was carried into the living room, but Miles walked directly to Arthur, who was sitting on the porch staring into the distance. The boy hugged him tightly and asked with a choked voice if he was also going to abandon them like everyone else. Arthur's heart stopped for a second. For in a fraction of a second he understood the truth he had tried to deny. He could no longer imagine his existence without the sound of those footsteps and the brightness of those eyes. He stood up, grabbed his keys, and told them to get in the truck, but Lucy insisted on walking to the stop, still trying to save him from himself. The old rural line bus was struggling along the dirt road, the sound of the diesel engine echoing through the valley as the fine rain still fell. Inside, Lucy looked out the foggy window, trying to hide her tears from the children. Miles was sitting next to her, with his face pressed against the glass, looking for any sign of Arthur's truck, which did not appear. Arthur, however, was fighting against the mud and reduced visibility, accelerating his old truck through paths he knew like the back of his hand. He felt his hands tense on the steering wheel, his knuckles white from gripping the worn leather so hard. For years he had allowed pain to defeat him, but today he was fighting back. When he finally spotted the bus stopped at the small integration station of Willow Creek, he braked sharply without caring about the water that entered through the door he had left poorly closed. As he got out, the station was almost deserted. Only the smell of brewed coffee and the rhythmic sound of rain on the tin roof filled the environment. He ran through the courtyard, his lungs burning from the cold air and the effort, until he found Lucy near the boarding gate. She held Alice's hand, who was clutching her old rag doll, while Miles was sitting on a wooden bench, looking at the ground with devastating sadness. As soon as the boy saw Arthur, his eyes lit up with a joy that seemed capable of dissipating all the mountain mist. "Grandpa Arthur!" he shouted, running into the arms of the man who knelt to receive him in a crushing hug. Lucy stood paralyzed, surprise and pain fighting on her face. "You shouldn't have come, mister." "Arthur, this only makes everything more difficult," she said, her voice almost disappearing in the noise of the bus engine preparing to depart. Arthur stood up, breathing deeply, and looked directly into her eyes. "I had to come, Lucy. I spent my life running away from things I couldn't control, but this time I can choose." For a few endless seconds, the world around them seemed to disappear. The sound of spoons hitting porcelain cups in the station cafe and the distant voices of the passengers were just background noise. Lucy lowered her head, saying that their stay would only bring more problems for him in town. "What people say doesn't matter anymore," Arthur stated with a conviction she had never seen before. "What matters is that you have become my family, and this house without you will go back to being just a heap of cold stones." Lucy felt the tears flow without control. Miles continued to cling to Arthur's leg as if he feared he was a mirage that could disappear at any moment. "We cannot accept your charity out of pity," she whispered. Arthur shook his head gently, approaching and taking Lucy's calloused hands in his. "It's not pity, Lucy. It's necessity. I need you as much as you need a roof. I lost many years living for sadness, believing that loving again would be betraying Catherine. But yesterday I read a letter from her, and I understood that she never wanted me to die while still alive." The cold wind blew through the open station, but the warmth between them was palpable. The bus driver honked, signaling the departure, but no one moved. Arthur took Catherine's letter from his pocket and handed it to Lucy. "She knew I would be a wonderful father. Maybe she was waiting for this moment to show me the way back." Lucy read the few lines and, for the first time, allowed herself to smile through her crying. Alice approached slowly and held Arthur's hand, a gesture of absolute trust that sealed the fate of everyone there. The bus departed, leaving behind a cloud of smoke and the sound of its departure, but the family that had formed under the reign of Willow Creek was already walking back to the truck. During the return trip, the atmosphere was one of serene peace, and the mountains seemed to welcome them back. The afternoon they decided to officialize that union began in an unexpected way. Arthur took Lucy and the children to the small stone chapel that sat atop a hill in Willow Creek, a place where the view reached the entire valley. Father Thomas was waiting for them, wearing his simplest robe, but with a smile that lit up his face marked by years of priesthood. He had realized that Arthur's charity had transformed into something much deeper, a mutual redemption. "So, let's do things the right way this time," the clergyman said, gesturing for them to enter the chapel, where only the light of the candles and the sun filtered through the stained glass created an atmosphere of the sacred. The wedding was a ceremony devoid of luxury, but overflowing with meaning. Lucy wore a simple dress that Mrs. Higgins, the same woman who had previously whispered in the bakery, had helped adjust, proving that Arthur's example of kindness had begun to change the community's perception. Arthur wore his dark linen suit, the same one he had used in solemn moments of his life, but now his shoulders were no longer hunched by the weight of mourning. Miles and Alice walked in front, carrying small branches of apple blossoms and wildflowers, symbolizing the life that was sprouting from the land Arthur loved so much. Father Thomas spoke about how God's love manifests in the most unexpected ways, and how the arrival of strangers can actually be the visit of angels destined to heal old wounds. When they exchanged vows, Arthur promised not just protection, but a life of presence and shared learning. He promised to be the father Miles needed and the guardian Alice deserved. After the ceremony, there was a small reception on the porch of the stone house. Some neighbors, moved by curiosity that had turned into respect, brought cakes, biscuits, and bottles of local cider. The music of a fiddle echoed through the mountains, mixing with the sound of children playing under the trees. Arthur observed everything with a serenity he thought he had lost forever. In the months that followed, he and Lucy traveled several times to the county seat to start the legal adoption processes for Miles and Alice. The process was long and bureaucratic, with many forms to fill and social workers to talk to, but each trip was celebrated as a victory. On one of those days, inside the judge's office, Miles asked with shining eyes. So now I am a Vance for real? Arthur felt his chest swell with pride, leaned over, and kissed the boy's forehead. You have always been my son. We were just waiting for the paperwork to understand that. Even the clerk at the registry office had to look away to hide her tears at that scene of pure love. The years passed like the seasons over the hills of Willow Creek, soft and transformative. The stone house ceased to be a hiding place, to become a lighthouse for others. Lucy planted gardens of roses and hydrangeas that colored the gray of the stones, and the creek in the back became the favorite place for summer afternoons. Alice grew up helping her mother harvest the fruit, becoming a young woman of contagious sweetness, while Miles became Arthur's right hand, learning all the secrets of the orchard and the care of the livestock. Arthur Vance's name came to be respected not for his wealth, but for the story of overcoming and humanity he had built. And although the longing for Catherine still existed, it was no longer a pain that prevented movement, but a sweet memory that motivated him to be the man she always knew he could be. He finally understood that life does not end with loss, but is renewed through the generosity of opening the heart to the new, allowing hope to bloom where before there were only ashes. He had found a way to honor the past by building a vibrant, loving future for 3 souls who had once been lost in the fog. 20 years had passed since that night of the storm, and the hills of Willow Creek continued to observe time with their millennial patience. The late afternoon sun of May, 2026, bathed the stone house in a melancholic and peaceful glow. Arthur, now with hair completely white, and hands marked by the furrows of work and age, rested in his rocking chair on the porch. He observed a group of small children running across the lawn, his grandchildren, who filled the air with shouts of joy and games that seemed to have no end. The legacy of that rainy night had multiplied into a whole new generation. Inside the house, the sound of laughter and the aroma of fresh-baked apple pie and warm coffee came through the open windows. Alice, now a grown woman and a dedicated mother, helped Lucy in the kitchen, while Miles arrived from the fields carrying his youngest son on his shoulders, who shouted enthusiastically upon seeing his grandfather. "Grandpa Arthur, look what I found in the orchard," the little one exclaimed, holding out a perfectly round and polished stone. Arthur smiled, that smile that had taken years to recover, and that was now his trademark. He took the stone with care, feeling the connection between the generations that now inhabited that soil. Lucy came out to the porch with 2 cups of coffee and sat down beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. They didn't need words. The silence between them was now filled with a deep understanding and gratitude for having survived so many storms together. Arthur looked at the old wooden door of the house and remembered the bitter man who had arrived there to wait for death. "I thought I was buying a tomb, Lucy," he said in a low voice, his voice thick with emotion. "But you gave me a garden." Lucy squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with the same tenderness from 2 decades ago. As the bells of the Willow Creek Church rang in the distance, calling for the evening prayer, Arthur felt an absolute peace. He knew his journey was closer to the end than the beginning, but there was no fear, only the certainty that he would leave behind something much larger than land or possessions. He would leave a lineage of love, resilience, and compassion. He looked at the mountains one last time before the sun disappeared, knowing that his heart was no longer moldy, but full of the life he had once tried to escape. The stone house stood strong, no longer a monument to grief, but a sanctuary for the living. Life, in its infinite wisdom, often leads us along winding and sometimes painful paths just to put us exactly where we need to be healed. For someone who has lived many decades, the story of Arthur is a powerful reminder that the human heart possesses a capacity for regeneration that defies all logic. Often throughout our existence, we believe that certain doors have closed forever, that certain pains are insurmountable, and that the rest of our days will be just a monotonous repetition of memories and regrets. However, what this story teaches us in such a human and profound way is that redemption usually does not come from great heroic events or planned drastic changes, but rather from small, unexpected encounters, the courage to reach out to a stranger, and the humility to accept that we need each other to survive. For those of us who have already seen the years go by and the seasons change so many times, true wisdom lies in understanding that loneliness is never a final destination, but a choice we often make out of fear of being hurt again. Arthur tried to shut himself in a stone shell, but life sent him the fragility of a child to break that armor. This shows us that it is never too late to start over, to learn a new name, to welcome a new family, or to discover that love has no quota or expiration date. It does not run out when we lose someone dear. On the contrary, it expands and transforms, finding new channels to flow through if we allow the windows of our soul to remain open. The humanity of a simple gesture, like sharing bread or offering a blanket, can be the beginning of a silent revolution in a lifetime of bitterness. Therefore, as we look back on our own trajectories, we must remember that the scars we carry are not just marks of pain, but proof that we were strong enough to survive and that we still have much to offer. The true wealth of a human being in the autumn of life is not measured by what he accumulated, but by the warmth of the hands that hold his when night falls. May the story of this stone house in the mountains serve as a lighthouse for all those who feel lost in the silence of their own losses, reminding us that as long as there is breath and a heart willing to open, there will always be room for a new morning full of laughter, warm coffee, and the sweet company of those we call family, whether they are of our blood or of destiny. Life is a gift that is renewed in the act of caring for others. And it is in this sacred exchange that we find the true meaning of our passage through this world, transforming deserts of loneliness into fertile fields of hope and belonging. In the end, we realize that it was not we who saved others, but the act of loving that saved us from ourselves.